Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for coming to the Allen School Colloquium. I'm delighted today to introduce to you Alex Spangher from USC, where he is a PhD student. Alex has an exciting career history that I'll just summarize by saying I don't know if we've ever interviewed someone who also worked for the New York Times. And not only that, has built systems that are used by organizations like the New York Times and Bloomberg. So today we're going to hear about uses of, you didn't put AI in the title. That's disappointing. No, actually it's refreshing. I take it back. It's refreshing. Towards planning in the AI sense in creative contexts and using AI in creative settings. So I will not tell you about all the wonderful paper awards and accolades that he has earned. I'll let him tell you about the work, which is more interesting. So, over to you.
Thank you so much, Noah.
I think I'm done with that.
Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you so much, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to chat with you guys about this work. Today, we're going to talk about planning in creative contexts. I want to start by describing something we do every day. Every day we come across a piece of information, whether that's a paper that lands on our desk, and we decide, that's interesting. I want to dig deep into it. And we start reading. That's cool. DeepSeek R1. Their models naturally emerge with reasoning behaviors through reinforcement learning. We immediately start to ask questions. What kind of RL did they use? Well, we can read the paper, and we say, oh, OK, it's this cool new method. What is GRPO? Why do they use it? At this point, we could either look at the cited paper, or we could go down the hall. We could talk to our friends. Maybe they can give us the answer. What cold start data did they use? Now, this is an interesting one because the answer is actually not in the paper. It hasn't been published. But we know something about the field. We know something about what other people are working on. We can make some inferences right or wrong. We can make inferences about what they did. For Noah or Hannah, we might want to ask, how do they actually define open source? What is happening here? What do we notice about this process? Well, firstly, as humans, we choose our own information-seeking pathways. These involve multiple steps. They often involve us choosing between multiple different directions. But what else do we notice is happening? Especially when we're consuming information that has been produced by other people. What kinds of questions are we asking? We're asking questions about what did they do? What kind of RL did they do? Why did they do this? What cold start data did they use? So when we're consuming information produced by other people, we are often trying to understand their actions. This is a process called emulation. I'm going to come back to this in a couple of slides. But this is a very human process. It involves lots of inferences and lots of guess-making. Before we go further, I want to ground us in a motivational domain that's going to serve as the umbrella for the larger discussion that we're going to have today. Journalism. Why journalism? Why should we talk about journalism? Well, journalism is crucially important for healthy societies. So a lot of research has shown that the more journalism you have, the more civic engagement, the less polarization, the more voting you have. In short, it's the mirror image of misinformation and the effects that misinformation has on society. But why now? Why should we care about this now? Well, the journalism industry is in crisis. So because of precipitous revenue declines, about half of the country is a news desert. That means people don't have access to local news. And the journalists that remain are under incredible time pressure. So if you've ever written a blog post or an article yourself, you know that 6 hours is not a lot of time. So if we care about this first point, if we care about healthy societies, we should think about how to help news outlets survive. This was something I knew very well at the New York Times. I saw both the lows, the layoffs, and the stresses, as well as the highs, the power that journalism could have. I actually got into journalism not knowing much about this social impacts, but because I really loved visualization. I loved maps. I loved bringing data to life. Any maps lovers out there? Maps are great. I also worked with David Bly to build the recommendation engine. This involved building new topic models and scaling them to millions and millions of users. I was heavily involved in kind of organizing the archives and surfacing interesting information from the archives. This one was interesting. This was actually the first time the New York Times ever acknowledged Black History Month. Now I want to talk about a task that's going to ground the rest of the discussion and serve as a lens for the theory and the methods that we're going to talk about. What is sourcing? Sourcing is journalists' own information-seeking pathways and behaviors. It's the process by which a story idea gets fleshed out, expanded, broadened by a number of different sources until it's ready for publication. Sourcing takes a lot of time. So about a third of journalists' time is spent just looking for sources. And it actually has a really steep learning curve, including, I gotta admit, your speaker today. I was always terrible at finding sources. As a result of these time requirements, as well as the time constraints that journalists face, sourcing is shockingly undiverse. Can we build tools to help journalists find the right sources? If we could do that, we might be able to lower costs, maybe address these news deserts, and also improve the quality and diversity of existing news. But let's dive deeper. What does this mean to find the right sources? Well, let's look at what journalists do to find their sources. Let's look at their process. So this was work that I did with folks from Stanford as well as Google News. We interviewed hundreds of journalists about their process for finding sources. I want to show you a representative interview. The journalist said, New Jersey announced that it would teach climate change in elementary school. I thought that sounded interesting, but I didn't know what the story would be. My editor gave me 8 hours. So the source finding process is happening in this context where goals are not clear. She doesn't know what information she's going to find. She's also, again, under incredible time pressure. So there's constraints to this process. I wanted to understand, how are teachers educating children? How do parents and kids feel? Some parents seemed uncomfortable. Is there more pushback? So this is why we're calling sourcing an example of planning in creative contexts. By planning, we mean any kind of decision-making, whether that's sequential or a priori, under constraints. So the journalist has limited time. They're facing constraints. For creative contexts, we're using a definition here from the problem-finding literature. The problem-finding literature says that a creative context is one in which the goal is not clear. The definition of success is not clear. So how might we learn to do this? How might we learn to plan in creative contexts? There's a lot of approaches in the machine learning literature that we might follow. Instruction following, human observation, trial and error, or something more like latent exploration. But all of these approaches face fundamental limitations. We either lack the data, the instructional data, or it's costly to observe humans. Or it's because we're operating under this creative assumption that we have a poorly defined success metric. We can't do something like latent exploration. Indeed, a lot of the big companies recently released tools, confusingly all named deep research, that purport to do this, that purport to go out and find a bunch of different sources. But the feedback so far has been mixed. People have said they hallucinate a lot, they miss key sources, and as ByCloud tells us, deep research is just mid. So what do we have, though? What do we have? We have the news article. We have the news article in abundance. We can collect this at scale. More abstractly, we can observe the end state of this human process, this human sequence of actions that led us to the end state. Wouldn't it be great if we could make inferences about these actions and what these actions were, right? Exactly what we did in the first slide. We were making inferences about the human's actions that created the DeepSeek article. This is actually a really well-studied form of social learning in the cognitive science literature. It's called emulation learning. Psychologists have shown children pictures of houses like this, towers, and they've shown that just by looking at the end state, just looking at a picture of the end state, the child could build houses that were bigger and more robust. It's been held up. End state observation has been held up as a key part of social learning that seems to play a key role in the development of cultures. It's been held up by philosophers as a key part of art, ritual, and other human behaviors, and it has strong overlaps. The idea of doing this backwards action inference has strong overlaps in artificial intelligence, like means and analysis, backtracking, and regression planning. But I would say our explicit focus on human behaviors here does set us apart from these areas. So what if we could do this in machine learning? What if we could just observe the end state and make inferences, noisy or not, noisy inferences about the actions that generated it? I would argue we would enter a new data regime, a data regime where we have voluminous, new inferential data that we can use to learn about human approaches and human values. We can use this data to train models that are aligned with human decision making. And ultimately, we can use these models to build more useful tools for humans. So bringing us back to journalism and sourcing, the goal of emulation learning in this talk is going to be to explore the news article and make inferences about the sources and the actions that the journalist did in the process of reporting. The rest of this talk is going to unfold in 3 parts. So first, I have to show you that this is even possible. I have to show you that we can make these inferences. Then, having shown that we can make inferences about human actions, I'm going to show that we can use these inferences to critique our models and improve their planning abilities. Finally, I'm going to show in part 3 that we can incorporate these plans into larger downstream processes. Just as a teaser, in the first part, we're going to show that action inference in text depends on long-range document-level reasoning. I'm going to talk very briefly about work I did with OpenAI this past winter, in which we did a similar thing for science. For part 2, I'm going to show that AI models struggle to plan in creative contexts. Hierarchical planners seem to be promising, but I'm actively exploring this at Google Gemini right now. Finally, in part 3, I'm going to share work I did with Ulether AI to introduce classifier-free guidance, which is a technique that test time technique, an inference-based technique that allows us to increase plan adherence. As Noah said, I've been honored by a number of awards in these areas, Outstanding Paper Awards and Best Paper Awards. I've been fully supported by a Bloomberg PhD fellowship plus grants that I wrote. And I've had a great time mentoring 27 undergrad researchers throughout the way. So I'm really excited about this direction. It brings together key areas of natural language processing, reinforcement learning, and ultimately human-computer interaction. It's an area I'm calling creative planning, and we have, I'm going to steal Tim's bridge here. We have a tutorial coming up at NACL where we are seeking to further unify the field and propose a direction forward. So without further ado, part 1, observe the plan. Remember, our goal here is to infer human actions just from final states. We have 2 research questions. First, is this even possible? And secondly, is there a pattern to the way sources are used? Starting with the first research question, why might this be a challenging problem? Well, here's a news article, really short and fictional news article. Mr. Altman said that OpenAI would investigate terms of service violations. Liang Wenfeng couldn't be reached for comment. Tech stocks have dropped, including NVIDIA. Investors were nervous. OpenAI will continue developing its latest model. These are actually all sourced sentences. But it might not be clear how they are sourced and what actions they imply. The first sentence is pretty obvious. These are both explicit references to actions, whether or not they resulted in a quote. The second one does not result in a quote. But these are explicit references to actions. The second one, an expert reader would know that a journalist following the norms of the industry would never publish this sentence without also performing these actions to check the stock market, to check with other investors. The third sentence is perhaps a little bit more tricky. OpenAI will continue developing its latest models. We have a fact about OpenAI. We have details about OpenAI. And we have another source from OpenAI, Sam Altman. So it's highly likely, not certain, but highly likely that Mr. Altman provided the information for the third sentence. So this is an example of a long-range reference. For those interested in linguistics, this is an extension of kind of Van Dyke macrostructures with an explicit tailor towards actions. So we recruited 2 professional journalists, and together we annotated 1,300 documents. We annotated them on the sentence level, so we were identifying the sources that they spoke to on each sentence. Our action vocabulary here is talking to sources. And then we asked, how well can we predict these attributions? So with a rules-based model, where we're just implementing kind of named entity searches and searches for quotatives like said verbs, we're pretty good at getting the explicit references, but we miss the other kinds. When we train a smaller model, like a BERT model, we're starting to get some more of the implicit references. But BERT models are worse at the kind of longer range reasoning and are missing a lot of the longer range references. Finally, with large pre-trained language models, we're able to start to get the long range references, which is exciting. But despite explicit instructions, despite large prompts, we're still missing many of the implicit references. So it doesn't seem like this ability to detect actions is kind of an emergent property of pre-training. Finally, when we fine-tune a GPT-3 model, we are seeing pretty good performance across all areas. OK, great. So we have a fine-tuned model. We have a model for human behaviors in this setting. What can this tell us? Well, we can say things about human behaviors. We can say things like critical coverage requires more sources. I'm going to define critical coverage a little bit better later. We can also say critical coverage uses more labor-intensive sources. So something like a person-derived quote takes a lot more labor to obtain than something like a court proceeding that you can just look up online. So these were novel inferences about human behavior that we can make by doing this kind of analysis at scale. Now let's move on to the second research question. Is there a pattern to the way sources are used? We're curious about this scientifically because if there is no pattern, if sources are used completely differently by different journalists, then this is fundamentally not a learning problem. So we need to explore this before making any kind of further progress. We're going to test for associative predictability. So we assume some kind of generative model for a document where sources are sampled. And then each source kind of provides words to the document. This is what the graphical model would look like. It's a very simple graphical model. And we're interested specifically in testing this. So does knowledge of the other sources that have been used help us make predictions about the new source, the next source? There's many ways we can test something like this. One way is an ablation probe. To construct this probe, we took news articles and we ablated either all of the sentences corresponding to one source. So these blue sentences corresponded to the student. Or we ablated sentences that did not correspond to any source. Then we have a simple classification problem. Is this article missing a source? What about this article? More formally, if this is our data-generating process, our goal is to train a classifier such that the performance of that classifier tells us something about the predictability of our problem. As long as we're careful for controlling for certain kind of data leakage, our null hypothesis will be if the classifier is random, then there is no predictability. If it's above random, then this is a structured problem. There's predictability here. So how do we do? Yeah.
So are you assuming that the sources are ordered?
We have heuristics to order the sources, like the order that they appear in the document, or the number of sentences attributed to them. We tried different things. These are all noisy heuristics.
Right, but I guess you are, in the graphical model, you are assuming an ordered sequence of sources?
That is the graphical model, and we're going to show that later. This experiment itself does not require ordering, because this is just, we can ablate any source in the document. Yeah. So when we remove the source that has the most sentences attributed to it, or the primary source, we're able to detect with very high accuracy. When we remove sources that have less and less sentences attributed to them, our accuracy does drop. Indeed, it becomes noisier to predict, if a random source at the end of the document is added or not. But we're still getting statistically significant performance. Our second probe is based on a data set we introduced in earlier work. This is the NewsEdis data set. The NewsEdis data set collected every time a news article is updated, we were able to collect the republications of that article. So this is a really cool data set, actually, because it gives us a lot more observability into the state space and how the state space progresses. The probe we designed here was to search for drafts where a source was added. So this does give us some temporal ordering. Now we have another classifier we can build. We can say, does this draft need a source? Very quickly, this required us to build a new sentence matching algorithm that is actually in use in other work right now. If you're curious, please ask me later. But when we test this probe, when we build classifiers for this probe, again, we are finding high degrees of accuracy. So what are our takeaways for this section? It seems that, yes, we can infer sources and actions with high accuracy, and sources are used in predictable ways. However, this may have seemed deeply unsatisfying to you, because there was a ton of manual work that went into creating this data set, identifying these behaviors. We would love in the future to be able to do this more automatically in new domains. It's actually the work that I did this past winter with OpenAI. OpenAI was interested in doing this for scientific articles to backtrack the actions that the human scientists did to create that article. I would also love to develop theoretical bounds for when actions can and cannot be inferred via end-state observation. There's doubtlessly tasks where the end-state observation alone doesn't give us enough signal to reconstruct the actions. Like this slideshow. It took many, many actions to produce this slideshow. I doubt it can be inferred how much pain went into this. I have ongoing work using the Bayesian wake-sleep cycle. I'm super excited. I chatted with some people about this already. I think it's very promising. I think it's very possible to do both of these things. But it's one of the things I'm really excited for going forward. OK. Brief clarifying questions. Time to move on. Now that we have our inferences, now that we have our actions, let's ask how we can use them to improve our model planning. So we have two research questions in this setting. First, can current AI models plan in the first place? And if not, what can we do to improve model planning? So actually, this was really fun work with C1. UW's own C1. Just some preliminaries. The data set that we'll be using throughout this section is a data set we collected of 250,000 press releases covered by 650,000 news articles. Another cool data set because this gives us observability into the starting state as well as the ending state. Many of these press releases were covered multiple times, giving us a sense of multiple plausible action trajectories here. I mentioned earlier we had this definition of critical coverage. Critical coverage is really important because this is the kind of coverage that journalists work hard for to actually critique a press release and not just digest whatever they've been saying, but to challenge it. And we developed a very simple metric that aggregates sentence level NLI onto the document level, allowing us to look for document level contradiction patterns. Happy to chat about that more later. I thought this was really cool because it was an extension of evaluations that are being used in summarization research. But then we took our news articles and we extracted all of the sources from them. We put them into a large database. And I'm going to come back to this in the second half of this section. OK, so for the first research question, can current AI models plan in creative settings? We're going to be doing a form of model criticism here. Model criticism comes out of the topic modeling research. It's a way of critiquing how well a model can predict your observed data. based on its parameters or latent states. So we're going to look at the latent states of the human data generating process, and we're going to compare it to machine latent decisions. More concretely, we're going to extract sources from news articles using the trained model that I just described in the previous section. And then we're going to ask an LLM to make recommendations about the kinds of sources that we should pursue. So we would say, in this example, we would say the legal professor and the employment lawyer probably have the same information, so they match, but the rest of the sources don't match. So these recommendations have overall a 1/3 overlap with what the human actually did. In general, we find that this pattern generalizes. So from zero-shot or few-shot settings, we find that LLM recommendations in general have a very low overlap with human actions. Fine-tuning does seem to increase performance, but there are still huge categories of sources that we're not recommending. And those categories are the less creative sources. So we measured creativity here on a 5-point scale, where a 1 was substantially uncreative, it's derivative from the press release, and a 5 takes the story in a totally new direction. A layperson would have never thought to talk to this source. In general, we find that humans are using sources that are far more creative than model recommendations. And this was a real example, actually. This was the actual sources that the human used versus what the language model recommended. These sources tell a really interesting story about like a big picture workplace harms, safety violations, whereas the LLM sources tell us kind of just like a detailed verbatim analysis of what is already there. So I argue that this is really important, as these systems are already getting deployed in settings like newsrooms. And research, including research here at UW, has found that writers and users tend to anchor on the generative ideas presented to them. So as we use AI in workflows, we are changing human behavior. We need to make sure that these AI tools have the behaviors that we want, the values that we want in our products. Because if we are introducing a less creative recommendation system or something like that, we will be changing the outputs. But hold on. I'm making some pretty grandiose claims here about creativity and planning. What if we're just creating an apples to oranges setting? So for example, there's many ways this experiment was apples to oranges, but one way is that the models had no access to world knowledge, whereas humans did. How can we be sure that the planning deficiencies, the drops in performance, were due to kind of fundamental limitations of the LLM, or just a bad experimental design? To rectify this, we designed a new experiment where the language model is now able to make recommendations and then query our source database that I described before. They get information from actual sources, and then they could use that information to update their next recommendations. So literally, the model is now allowed to issue queries to databases. For example, what issues of racial harassment exist at Tesla's Fremont factory? How have they impacted employees? The retrieval database then gives us back these two, which are considered hits because they were actually used in the Ground Truth News article, Owen Diaz and Melvin Berry. The other two were not used in the news article, so they're considered misses. And we continue onwards. I would just like to pause and say this is really cool because this is an example of a multi-document retrieval problem where we actually have ground truth data. Like we can actually say that this collection of documents or sources is required to tell this narrative story. So here's the process a little bit more abstractly: queries, databases. How does this perform? I'm going to show you an illustration. This is sentence embeddings of both the initial query as well as the retrievals in two-dimensional space. So the first query lands somewhere in the middle of the space. And the second query continues to explore the space, as well as the third query. But over and over again, we see the language model getting stuck in these patterns where it's just repeating the same query kind of over and over again. Indeed, when we compare this experiment, which is an interleaving experiment, when we compare it to the baseline of dense passage retrieval, we're definitely improving. But because we get stuck, we are missing many of the more diverse sources. On the other hand, how would a human explore this space? Here's the ground truth for that article. We noticed two things. So first, the human is exploring the space much more diversely. There's a lot more exploration. But there seems to be a structure here. So the human said, well, I need an anecdote that's very different from the initial query. But then I also need to confirm that anecdote. So I need to find another source that has substantially the same information just for the processes of confirmation. So we hypothesized that a more accurate cognitive model here is one in which there is a higher level plan being executed or a higher level sequence of actions. What is this action space? Well, we come up with one attempt here in this work. This is definitely not the end of the story, but we use an 8-dimensional discourse schema from Van Dyke, and we label all of the sources in our ground truth data set with one of these 8 components. So we get these sequences of discrete variables. When we give the language model the oracle, we give the language model the schema element pertaining to the source that the human actually used, we find a dramatic increase in performance. So giving these hierarchical elements allows us to explore the space a lot more broadly. And then when we try to learn how to do this in a hierarchical fashion, so we train this simple LLM, a small LLM that can take just the history of actions and the history of queries and predict the next action. We are seeing performance increases of 10%. So can current AI models plan in creative settings? The evidence seems to point to no, even in more realistic settings where they have access to world knowledge. What can we do to improve model planning? Well, we think higher order planners is promising, but there are a lot more directions to go in. We would love to incorporate planning approaches like MCTS, or even simple reasoning approaches like the stuff you guys have been doing with S1 to increase performance. Doing so requires us to make fundamental progress in understanding human values and rewards. I believe that these action sequences here that we're learning can help us get there through something like inverse reinforcement learning. I also believe that hierarchical planning strategies seem to be able to better capture human approaches, but this is work that I'm actively exploring right now with the Google Gemini 2.0 Flash Thinking team, which as of last week was #1 on the leaderboard. But don't check again, because you'll see a different story. In this section of the talk, this is work that I did with Ulether AI. In this section of the talk, we're going to ask, given a plan that we like, a plan that we think is a good plan, how can we faithfully execute this plan in some kind of larger downstream process, like generating a news article? Well, one way to do that is to put the whole plan into an LLM. So we might instruct the LLM to say, well, first introduce this source, then introduce this source, then compare them, and then end with this source. However, as we've all experienced, the longer your prompt is, the more complicated your prompt is, the more likely the language model is to get lost. So we introduced a technique called classifier-free guidance into language modeling. Classifier-free guidance introduces a guided or a controlled distribution. Actually, Luke and co-authors might recognize this because they had a very contemporaneous paper to ours. The guided and the controlled distribution tries to predict the next token, conditioned on the previous tokens, as well as the prompt. And it is a combination of the naive language modeling distribution here. So this is what you would just get out of a pre-trained language model, minus the unconditional language distribution. What effect does this have on the next token prediction? Well, If today in France here is our prompt, the effect of subtracting away the unconditional logits is to force us to focus on the prompt more and more, and to pay less attention to the syntax or the grammar of the previous generation. It requires 2 passes through our model, so we need to generate logits for the prompt condition distribution as well as the unconditioned distribution. So this is double inference costs. But more fundamentally, does this actually solve our problem? We kind of outlined this multi-part prompt, this complicated plan, but it seems like this guided distribution just upweights the entire prompt. So we introduced another distribution called the negatively conditioned distribution. This distribution includes a prompt to upweight and a prompt to downweight. It depends on the counterfactual language distribution as well as a weighting factor. So notice that this still requires 2 passes to the language model, one to generate the counterfactual distribution, the other to generate the prompt condition distribution. How can we use this to follow plans? Well, if we set one part of the plan to be the upweighted prompt and then the rest of the plan to be the downweighted prompt, we can start generating, and then we can switch, and we can iterate through the plan like that. We tested this in the following setting. We tested this in the setting where we have a system-level prompt as well as a user prompt. This is especially important in jailbreaking scenarios where the user might want to try to override the system-level prompt. We find that users appreciate our generations across all ranges of hyperparameter settings. We also find that classifier-free guidance improves language modeling performance across a whole range of benchmarks that we tested. So now let's come back to the question of this double inference cost. Was this double inference cost worth it? And actually, the answer we find is yes. The performance increases that we observe are so large that you can use a smaller language model with CFG and get the performance of a language model twice as large. So because of these findings, our work has been incorporated into major open source libraries like Hugging Face, Vermeil here is a co-author, and labo.cpp, and is widely in use by the open source community. So returning to our research question, can we enforce greater plan following? The answer seems to be yes. But we have a lot of directions we want to go here. So we would love to use CFG in settings where we have longer plans, kind of what I outlined in the start of this section. Whoops. I would love to incorporate these plans into agentic systems. So if you have agents that are talking to each other by passing completions to the agent's prompt, we can use CFG to upweight different parts of these communications. If a human intervenes, if a human goes in and changes what an agent is saying to another agent, we can use CFG to upweight that human contribution. Also, CFG gives us another tool for scaling test time compute. So we can pay twice the compute to get better synthetic data, and then maybe bake this data into models with post-training. OK, returning to the big picture. We set out to explore this concept of emulation learning, where in the first part we asked, is it possible to observe plans? Yes, it seems to be possible to learn actions just from final state observations. Next, we asked whether we could use these actions to critique and improve model planning. And finally, we asked how to incorporate these plans into larger downstream processes. Going forward, I have a lot of different directions that I'd love to go in. Summarizing the future works that I discussed already, we would love to automatically be able to learn plans, as well as describe when we can do this and when we can't do this. I would love to use these observations to do better planning, including hierarchical planning. And finally, I would love to execute these plans into larger systems. Going forward, in the longer term, all we have really done here is imitation. Everything that I've shown you in this presentation is just trying to imitate human behavior. But I would love to go further than that. In step 2, we can go forward. We can learn rewards from these action sequences and then do something like inverse reinforcement learning or apprenticeship programs to start to make better and quicker and shorter decisions. Finally, we can do proactive NLP. If we can do a good job of learning human reward functions, then we can choose the reward functions that we like and add them to reward functions that we feel like can improve other processes. For example, I said, sourcing is shockingly undiverse. If all we're doing is imitation, then all we can hope to do in the future is to perpetrate these patterns. So I would love to use this frame of analysis to both understand those negative patterns as well as try to improve them. There's many ways we can do this. I mean, something like preference learning or mixed preferences, work that I know that's very active here at UW, is a very promising candidate. But there are other promising candidates as well. We can do things like looking at potential actions. This would be following off of fundamental research I did in fairness and transparency to introduce actionable recourse. We can also look at malicious actions, kind of the worst possible actions. This would be building off of work that I did with Eric Horvitz and team, looking at misinformation. Misinformation in general is very exciting to me. I know there's a lot of researchers here at UW that are very interested in misinformation. I would love to continue this line of work, maybe with this framework, to better understand patterns of misinformation, how malicious actors are acting. Within computational journalism, I've spent a long time talking about recommending sources. But this isn't the only part of the computational journalism pipeline that we've worked on. From finding stories to adding structure to editing and updating stories, we've used emulation learning to study human behaviors throughout this entire process and build tools throughout this entire process. So I would love to continue all of these different directions. I would also like to get it in front of real journalists. My work is already being used at places like Bloomberg, New York Times, and Stanford Big Local News. But I would love to go further. So here's an interface for the source recommendation problem that we've been talking about today. I would love to partner with local partners like Seattle Times, or even UW's own city council data. My good friends, Ava Brown is a PhD student at the iSchool and has done tireless work in collecting city council meetings and transcripts and stuff like that. I've had a lot of educational impact, particularly in the realm of writing. So we've built a tool here that can help students understand the structure of their writing drafts. And the idea being, once they can see the structure of the writing, they might be able to decide how to improve, how to start with a better introduction or make the introduction more clear. This work has been used at USC as well as other places. In fact, I'm on an AI task force at USC in which we're designing the next generation of journalism education using AI. Finally, I would love to have impact outside of journalism. So I've talked about a lot of this work in journalism, and I've talked briefly about my work in science with OpenAI. I'm also working on large symbolic music models. I'm working on learning kind of the planning decisions that composers make. Little known fact about me, I'm a Juilliard-trained musician. That's me performing with the prima donna of the San Francisco Opera. I've been involved in other creative domains with USC and UCLA. I've even been involved in kind of modeling nuclear plasma fusion reactions with the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center. I put computational genomics on here because I know there's a lot of people here that work on bio and genomics. I would love to extend into this domain. I think long-form analysis, structural analysis of text is very well applicable to problems in genomics. And I would love to do research in this domain. Finally, returning to Tim's bridge, returning to this intersection here of natural language processing, reinforcement learning, and human-computer interaction, I want to answer this question: why the Allen School? Well, I'm really excited about the work that is going on here. Obviously, in natural language processing, this is an incredibly strong community. And there's social thinkers, people that are thinking about proactive NLP, open science, retrieval augmented LLMs, which I think really is the future of LLMs and how LLMs will stay up to date with changing information. In reinforcement learning, I'm really excited about the work going on here in social RL. Also work in latent action inference, which I think is highly relevant to this work. In human and computer interaction, there's a lot of people focused here on improving informational systems, like the Center for the Informed Public. And a lot of people that I've met with today focused on new methods for behavioral analysis, whether that's lab in the wild, large-scale data set collections. I would love to collaborate. I think my work also is broadly relevant within the UW community, whether that's for linguistics, policy and education, communications, within AI, within psychology and cognitive science, and within visualization and other forms of system design. In the end, going forward, AI gives us the tools to understand and impact human decision-making. That's me feeling profoundly impacted by Matt Rainier and understood. I spent the summer living here in Seattle, working for MSR, and it was a really, really great summer. I think if we're careful, I imagine a future where machines can fit better into human workflows, align better with human values, and ultimately positively impact our society. Thanks to everyone who helped me along the way, as well as the funding I've received. Thanks to all my undergrad and graduate level collaborators. So.
Thanks. Super cool talk. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to just clarify the contributions in part 2. So in part 1, I guess you talked about how you can fine-tune models in particular to identify sources, including from long-range interactions, right, in articles. And I guess in your future work, for example, you talked about how you want to infer the trajectory from the end state, and therefore use that inferred trajectory to help you do the planning. I think I might have missed, how did you use, for example, the inferred sources to actually improve article writing in section 2?
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was unclear. So in section 2, we used, okay, so in section 2, we labeled sources in ground truth writing with one of these 8 discourse roles.
Annotation of these sources.
Human annotation plus, classifiers that we built.
Okay, so you annotated some stuff, then you build a classifier to annotate it at scale, and then you use that. Yeah. Okay.
And then we use these ground truth annotations with some kind of induced ordering, which you asked about earlier, to train this small autoregressive language model. And this language model took in the history of these queries, as well as the history of the discourse labels, and all it did was predict the next discourse label of the next source.
Okay, so it's sort of the going from interleaving to the planned interleave retrieval.
Yes.
If we didn't have the source identification, we could still do the interleaving row?
Yeah, if we didn't have the source identification, then the interleaving process is just this sequence of queries.
Okay.
I think if I, it was that.
Yeah.
Okay, if I can maybe extend on your question a bit, I think one might have a credible argument that there's what really is separating this from something like chain of thought, because technically, chain of thought really, all these dependencies exist in chain of thought as well, but the nature of hierarchical planning allows us to kind of be a little bit more parsimonious about our dependencies. We can enforce more kind of higher level dependencies here on this kind of the top thread that then make sure that we're on track and we don't get lost, which is often something we see in language models. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff that I'm working on right now.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Super interesting work. No, so I just had one more question. So you're looking at inferring the sources and the way people were selecting sources, but it seems like you could also use similar methods to infer other actions by the writers, such as selecting which quotes they're going to choose from the sources, and therefore how, maybe this is related to more of the misinformation angle, but how they choose to present a story, and you can almost like develop a profile of different writers. Is this something you looked into or interested in looking into?
Very interested in looking into this. I didn't talk really at all about kind of this larger pipeline. So, whoops. Some of what you're asking is incorporated into steps like structuring the story. And of course, there's a lot of actions here involved in like how the choice of structure comes to be. We used a very similar approach where we were doing kind of emulation learning on existing documents. We were interpreting the structure of these documents. And again, we were trying to kind of plan out structured documents. I think some of your other questions are kind of offshoots of source recommendation. Like once you have the sources, then can you interview the sources? Can you get the quotes from the sources? Yeah, there's a whole process. We have some work in automatically interviewing sources. That's the news interview work here. I'm super interested in general. I think there's a lot of questions that we could ask in this process, and a lot of these questions have implications for, as you say, misinformation or the understanding better the way we convey narratives in our society.
Any of those, do you think, are like, and just a quick follow-up, any of those are like immediate applications of the methods you have already developed, or do you need to develop truly very distinct methods?
They are nearly immediate. The key problem that we do face whenever we're trying to do action inference for new tasks is to define a vocabulary for what those actions are. So far, that's been a manual process. As you've seen throughout this talk, we've kind of defined this action space manually, whether it's a discourse schema or whether it's just the notion of talking to sources. Yeah, I would love to take steps and explore what we can do to learn this vocabulary a little bit more automatically. I do think that like this is the beauty of chain of thought and language modeling, is that these action spaces can be infinite. So I would love to explore kind of combinations of chain of thought with hierarchical modeling and other ways of more directly modeling human actions.
More questions? Yeah, okay. I can go, but you can go.
Okay. Maybe a very broad one, so I don't know if it's too far out of scope. I'm just thinking about at societal level changes that have happened in the news. It seems like really the most detrimental thing has been the collapse of local journalism.
Yeah.
I know it's been a huge problem across Washington State. Do you see this as mostly orthogonal to that? I mean, my understanding is a lot of the problem there is just basic operational costs and having somebody who can show up to city council meetings, sports games, basic things, et cetera.
Yeah. I'm very influenced by my mentor, James Hamilton at Stanford, who is an economist by training. And like you just outlined there, also frames this question as a trade-off between the costs of doing news have stayed the same, but the revenues that news can bring in have fallen precipitously. So that is why we see these newspapers going out of business. The vision here is that if we can do all of these things and we can do them well, we'll be lowering the cost of producing quality news. So I'm imagining a pipeline where we shave off 30-40% of the time it takes to do each of these steps. And then it's possible for a journalist to operate in an area that might be a news desert, because it becomes a lot more feasible to do something like cover city council or find good sources, find diverse sources.
Okay, I'll ask one. So at the end, you kind of brought it home and said, here are all these other creative contexts where planning might be useful. And it went fast, so I might have missed it. But there was one missing that you had mentioned earlier on that it was quite close to home for all. Yeah, here we go. You didn't. Oh, you did say science. Okay. So yeah. So I guess I'm curious. Then I have to pivot because I thought you didn't. I missed. I just. So. If we wanted to do kind of follow the same plan that you're following, no pun intended, that you're following in journalism, and we wanted to do it in science, can you comment on, the big companies tried to create these deep research things, which are garbage. So, this is getting recorded, isn't it? You don't know who I am. I'm not on screen.
I'm also in a lot of trouble. We both are.
So what would you do differently so that you're actually supporting high quality scientific work?
What would I do differently in
applying lessons from what you've learned in journalism, or if you were tackling that instead of journalism, in contrast with those failed attempts by our friends in industry?
So I really can't say too much about the stuff I did at OpenAI.
Ironically.
You must work at like an open science company or something. Fundamentally, I don't see what happens at deep research as being at all similar. My understanding of deep research is that they simply took reasoning models that were trained in like math and coding or whatever, and then assumed that reasoning would just generalize into this new domain. I think there's a lot of generalization assumptions that people make about these models. So it's not a surprise to me that they don't work there very well. How I would do this in science would be more to, I assume what you're talking about is something like citation prediction or.
Why not? I mean, science is big, right? To be a scientist, I have to create a really big plan with a lot of actions.
Yes.
And I have to pay other people to do most of them.
Yes. Okay. So I want to use this illustration. We're all scientists. We all read a lot of research. We're all very capable of reading between the lines and understanding the experiments that a scientist did. Maybe they got negative results. Maybe they didn't report that experiment. We can make those inferences, right? So this is a very possible human perceptual task. I think it's not at all unimaginable that we can use kind of this latent structure for action inference to make noisy guesses about this trajectory. So what I would do is I would just do this at scale. I would kind of look at lots and lots of science, look at kind of the trajectories and the decision making. We can look at different sub trajectories in there if we're just curious about particular experiments. And I would build planners that try to help you along that process, that show you there's many parts of science that are very creative and require us to think across and make big jumps. There's other parts that are very execution-oriented and formulaic. So I would love to see planners that could help us with some of those more execution-oriented things. Planners that tell us, for instance, you're missing a major benchmark. You should test against that benchmark. Or what about this cool new method? Here, you should benchmark against this method. I'll implement it for you. I think stuff like that is within the realm of possibility, and it could accelerate the way we do work.
Hi, thank you. This is a super high-level question. Have you thought about the idea of maybe composing plans together? And when you have some sort of task that needs to happen, is it like, so the diagram that you had earlier of like planning, observing, like learning, executing, and so that's structured for one plan, and I have another plan, and do plans compose pretty nicely in this model, or have you thought kind of abstractly about what it means? Like, what are some limits? Are there certain types of plans that are easy to model, and are there some limitations to what we can do when we kind of, compose plans together?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And this is why I'm really excited to be talking to people in reinforcement learning who have studied stuff like this for a long time. So, hierarchical planning and plan compositionality is like nothing new in fields like robotics. So I would love to have collaborations in this area, explore this. The short answer is that I don't know, and I haven't tried this yet in text and in NLP, but I don't see why this wouldn't be able to work. As long as we can formulate rewards in the right way, as long as we can collect enough data, I think it's entirely possible.
Okay, I think we'll end there because we're a bit over time. Let's thank the speaker again.